Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RE008, where we take old TFOS and give them a modern twist, as we push them up to the modern standards. This particular story is called The Best We Have to Offer, written by RegalLegalEagle. When humans finally started to expand beyond their systems, they found that they weren't alone in the galaxy. In fact, their neck of the woods, so to speak, held many other species, all trying to expand at the same time. Through some cosmic twist, most species were at about the same technological level, and everyone started to do what they could to secure their strength. Unfortunately for humanity, their biggest neighbor was a race of war-loving half-machine bugs who wanted the system humanity had just started to colonize. The war raged for 10 years, claiming millions of lives, but in the end, humanity had won, reducing the machine bugs' home to a cracked open dead husk while claiming their system. It had been a hard-won victory, however. The human population had been weakened, and after 10 years of conflict, the economy was struggling. There was no grand federation of peaceful planets to turn to, but a recent consortium of power and wealthy species had formed. The Triumvirate was hosting a massive expedition for all competing species to determine who they should invest their vast trade wealth into. With the tech a little behind the Triumvirate and their resources plentiful but common, humanity had to determine what set them apart. Physically, every species had some skill or advantage. Humanity was more adaptable and tenacious than any of their neighbors, but it was hard to sell tenacity or adaptability. What they needed was to present something that set them apart and made them unique in the galaxy. It was also clear their neighbors wanted to stop them from earning the trade contract. Humanity needed to find the best we have to offer.
Agent Wakefield, please respond.
Proceed, station.
The cartel is aware of your location. You need to move.
I'm securing the special materials required for our presentation.
Well, secure them and move.
Agent Wakefield cursed as she quickly began to stuff the packages into a secure metal box she had been provided. The genetic lock should make sure only she could open it, but their enemies would just destroy it rather than open it. Their last shipment of supplies waiting at the Triumvirate Conference had been sabotaged, and they had to send for replacements through courier. Only the Triumvirate had ships fast enough to make it to Earth and back in time, and humanity had paid handsomely for the service. She was in a secure room at the courier office at the massive space station that had been constructed just for this trade show. It was a sprawling mass orbiting the Triumvirate's recently colonized Eden world Chrysalian. All three species had colonized it to showcase their solidarity, but this trade station was the real draw. Over 15 square miles of rooms, hallways, meeting rooms, docking bays, and of course, the main trade conference center. The courier office was in the far arm, away from the trade conference at the edge of the station. She had quite a ways to go to make it back in time. Tucking the box into a secret pocket, she stepped out of the secure room and was suddenly face to face with two energy pistols. They were being held by a pair of lanky green deckish thugs. They were humanoids with subpar intelligence that were employed by the cartel.
Give it up, human!
The other species in the office screamed at the sight of the weapons and ran out of the office, leaving her alone with the two thugs. Oh dearie me, is this a robbery? Oh me, oh my, but why do you want pictures? But why do you want pictures of my grandchildren? I'm only a poor old grandmother. The thugs frowned at that and examined the human in front of him. It was a female that was particularly hunched over, with pure white hair, and a floral dress that covered everything but her hands and her face. She had a worried face that looked wrinkled and aged. Their implants were informing them that she was likely a human grandmother based on age and appearance. They lowered their guns as one pulled the communicator.
Boss, it's us, the ones you told to stop the human at the courier's office. I think that it's been a wrong one, boss. It's really old.
As the thugs stood around talking on the communicator, the old lady slowly reached into her dress, and before either could stop her, quickly yanked free her stunner, quickly zapping each of them. They jerked and twisted as electricity coursed through their bodies, and the agent smiled. She then pulled away the dress to reveal a black catsuit beneath it, with a utility belt and various weapons strapped about her body, not to mention the secure box on her back. The wrinkles on her face flickering away as she deactivated her costume. But the white hair was still white. "Sorry, boys, my hair's just like this." She pulled a knife free from her thigh, but then looked up as the door to the office burst open. A massive Gulk bull lumbering in, carrying a heavy repeater that she thought that could only be mounted on a grav tank. "Gotta run, fellas." She sprinted to the side as the Gulk took aim, bolts streaming through the air as she sprinted, jumping forward onto her hands and then springing up to crash through the window feet first. Bolts were still streaming around her as she landed with a roll and sprang to her feet. The station's broad streets had screaming civilians running every which way as she saw more cartel thugs running her way, Gulks and Deckish alike. She pulled the pistol free as she ran forward, tapping a device on her belt. For her mission, the agent had been provided with the very best gear that humanity could make, and a few pieces that I had to buy from elsewhere. This was one of those Xeno trinkets that she hoped they could replicate soon. The device hummed to life, and suddenly she was in a bubble of modified gravity. It would nullify the pull against her when she jumped, and reorient it according to her position when she landed. So, as the cartel took aim, she leapt, sailing high into the air as she spun, feet touching the seating as the device reversed the local gravity around her. She sprinted forward along the seating as they began firing, trying to readjust their aim. But then she just jumped again, landing on the roof of one of the local structures in this section of the station. All around her, the vents and machinery were peppered with bolts, and then she jumped to the ground at the end of the street, rolling and sprinting forward, which sent her flying forward thanks to the device on her belt. Once she was around the corner, she deactivated the gravity reorganizer and quickly checked her implant. It was another 8 miles to the conference center. She had no idea how many cartel thugs were between her and her objective. She needed a way to move faster. The mag trains! She quickly routed to the nearest station, half a mile ahead, and sprinted forward. Agent Wakefield's vitals were in the corner of her eye, and she could monitor her blood oxygen levels, the modifications she received making her stronger, faster, and tougher than a normal human. They hadn't gone full cyborg like those bugs they waged war with, but they'd learned how to make more subtle improvements. Her implant informed her a train would soon be arriving, and she set her head down, sprinting as fast as she could, ducking and spinning around the civilians in a way as they yelled at her angrily once she was past. Rounding the corner into the station, she leapt clean over the ticket taker and rolled into the open door of the mag train just as it began to close. The other Xenos on board gave her surprised looks, but she smiled and stood up, holding on to one of the overhead handles as the machine started to move. There was a slight jerk as it left the interior of the station, now racing along the outside in space. She monitored the map on her implant, smiling as she was suddenly a mile closer, then another half mile before the train slowed down for the next station. If her luck held out, she could ride this all the way to the conference center. There was a slight jerk as it entered the atmosphere again and stopped for the next station, doors opening. Civilians got on and off, and she smiled. But then, just before the doors closed, she saw 2 Gulks and 3 Deckish jump into the first car. She cursed and moved down to the last car, hiding around a bulkhead from the door, out of the line of sight down the train. She couldn't use a gun since bullets might break the glass windows and sent them all into space. She heard the gasps of people as the cartel thugs walked along the cars while the train got moving again. Hearing their footsteps get closer, Wakefield pulled that knife up from her thigh once more. A heavy Gulk stepped through the door looking around, and as he turned to see her, that knife was driven through his eye. The creature didn't even have time to scream as the heavy bulk dropped to the ground. A Deckish stepped forward, gun raised, but Wakefield grabbed his arm and drove her knee into his ribs. She heard a crunch as he grunted out in obvious pain, and she turned, pulling on his arm and tossing him into the wall behind. The next Deckish had a humming energy blade and charged forwards. She quickly parried with her own knife and danced back, careful to keep him in between her and the others. He lashed out with a knife as she ducked and spun, kicking his feet out from under him before driving the knife into his throat as he fell. She then rolled over his body, grabbing his energy blade and throwing it as she got up, watching it sink into a chest of the third deckish. As he fell, the Gulk behind him just growled, slamming one meaty fist into his palm. The Gulk had to weigh at least 600 pounds. They possessed pointed horns for gouging, a thick leather skin resistant to blades, and had a bone structure as dense as some light tank armor. Wakefield pulled her pistol free and shot him right through one eye. Even point blank, a pistol round couldn't penetrate their skulls, so it just rattled around inside, pulping his brain matter without a risk of her breaking the glass in the train. The bigger they come, the harder they fall. As the body fell to the ground with a heavy thud, she smiled and holstered her pistol. Then she heard the civilians gasping and pointing. She turned to see a Tachem assault craft just outside, speeding alongside the train. Oh crap. She began to run forward as bolts slammed into the car, the screams of the civilians filling the air, which was quickly sucked out of the holes of the newly shattered windows. She pulled a mask up from her belt, slapping it into place as smart fibers quickly expanded around her head, sealing into place. She activated the device on her belt again, diving and ducking as Xeno civilians sailed past her, sucked out into space. Pulling her pistol free again, she shot the side window on the front of the car as she ran towards it, making sure that it was started to break just as she jumped forward, sailing out into space as the shards of glass bumped off her smart fiber suit. The 4 armed Tachem gunners on the side of the assault craft blinked in surprise as the human was suddenly sailing towards him. But as he tried to pull his hands to grab hers, she turned, touching him feet first. The gravity reorganizer instantly focused all of her momentum and gravity into the points of her feet, crushing the Tachem's chest and sending the body flying through the open door through the assault craft. The interior was open, normally meant to hold a Tachem assault squad, but this craft was only carrying that gunner and a pilot who was looking back at her, quickly trying to pull his wave blaster free. She stepped forward, leaning into it as she punched him in the face of his pressure suit, the glass cracking as he was knocked out. But that made him slump forward against the controls. The assault craft drove forward then, as Wakefield jerked and held on to avoid being tossed out into space. Looking through the viewport, she saw the craft diving towards the station that the shot-up train was slowly pulling into, sparkling and smoking as it arrived. Civilians inside gasping at the sight of the train, but then they cried and pointed up as the craft followed it in, smashing through the glass on top of the station, now decompressing the station itself. More Xenos were sucked into space as Wakefield held onto the craft with all her strength, the gravity device almost out of power. It had slammed into the platform, sliding through the ticket terminal, sparks of metal flying as it scraped along the floor of the station. It burst through another wall and out into the street beyond, hitting some sort of food store which must have used a gas to cook as something exploded, fire raining down on the local stores. More civilians were screaming and running as sirens sounded all around the area, blast doors slowly descending to seal the area. But Wakefield was already out of the crashed craft, sprinting forward as she dove and slid under one of the heavy doors as it fell into place behind her with a solid thud. As she stood up, she glanced at her map. 4 miles to go.
Agent Wakefield, what is your status? We have reports of fighting in the station.
You could say it's an explosive situation, she replied as she pulled the mask off her face. She didn't want to waste her oxygen reserves. Looking around, she saw running civilians, but no cartel thugs just now. She began to run forward once more, looking at her map to try and determine the best course of action. Can't you send in the Marines?
Negative, Agent Wakefield. The cartel is a criminal organization. We're a government. We cannot bring military operations onto foreign territory without permission.
Wakefield sighed and shook her head as she continued to run. Just as she entered another intersection, however, she saw a flash of light in her peripheral vision and quickly ducked and rolled. A high-energy bolt sailed through the area her head had been. She dove behind an automated cleaning droid that was slowly scrubbing the street as more bolts slammed into the area around her. She pressed her back against the droid, moving along next to it. She had no other good cover along the street, but if the droid got closer to the access hatch, then a bolt slammed into the droid, which whined, coughed, and then died. Growling, she edged along the droid, keeping her head down. As she reached the front, she pulled a small wire from a pocket on her belt angling it at the corner. Her implant switched over to vision from a tiny cable camera as she examined the area. TACOM sniper team on the roof of the bank in the center of the block. She pulled the cable back, tucked it away. She could hear civilians crying out in surprise and heard people moving. Cartel thugs had to be closing in on her location. Sure enough, she saw a Dekish burst out of the shop in front of her, on the exposed side of the droid that she was taking cover behind. She shot him through the throat with a pistol and fired a few more rounds to keep the others behind him from rushing forward. She quickly pulled a sphere from her belt, pushing the button on the cover and tossing it in the air. There was a hiss as grey smoke began to pour out of it, and yet, as the TACOM sniper switched his scope over to heat, his whole field of vision was red. As he kept cycling through vision modes, something was impairing his vision on every one. The Gulks in the Dekish just charged in anyway. As the smoke slowly cleared, the cleaning droid was alone. They looked around, and none noticed as the access hatch on the street slowly clicked back into place. Wakefield moved along as quietly as she could, partially hunched over in the small access space. Scurrying along, she finally found a more open section. Stepping out into the section of crosswalk and pipes, leading to various humming and chugging machines. There were Rulians crewing the station. Thick black goggles covered their 4 eyes, oil stains their scales. When they saw her, she heard one of them shout, "Hey, that's gotta be a human the cartel is offering a bounty for." They quickly started to run along the catwalks to rush at her. Wakefield sighed and readied herself. The first ran at her, had a large wrench in his hand. He swung it overhead at her, but she quickly turned to avoid the strike, elbowing him in the face and driving her knee into the chest as she pulled him down into it. Then she had to lean back over the railing, watching a blade arc over her face as another slashed at her. Then he tried to stab down, but she rolled to avoid it and grabbed his arm, driving her knee into his stomach, and then tossing him over the edge of the railing. He screamed out as he fell to the floor below. 2 were charging up the metal stairs to get to her, and she jumped, grabbing a pipe to swing her feet forward, kicking the lead one as it drove him back, crying out as he toppled and fell back down the stairs on top of the one behind him. Jumping down and landing on the top of them for good measures, she only had a few more to go. One more ran at her, swinging with a wrench wildly. She rolled past, grabbing his leg and yanking it up to make him fall to the floor of the catwalk, quickly kicking him in the head to keep him down. Then another grabbed her from behind, hugging her arms to her chest as another moved in. But she just stomped on his foot, making him howl in pain as it broke his hold. Then she grabbed his arm, bending over as she tossed him over her shoulder into the one in front of her. Turning, she only had one more to deal with, but was surprised when he leaned forward, knocking his skull into her own. Both her and her attacker gasped out in pain then, each clutching their forehead as they staggered around. "Ah, my head!" he groaned out as she grunted and clutched her own skull. "The feck, I don't know," he muttered and just sort of staggered to a crate and sat down. She straightened up slowly, wincing as she kept an eye close because her brain told her to. It just felt right. She approached the Rulian, who looked up in time to see her fist as she clocked him in the face, and he slumped off the crate. "Fecker," she muttered, and held her forehead with one hand, and she walked on. The Rulians behind her groaning in pain or lying unconscious. Then she heard the hum of a lift and saw a Rulian with a bunch of electrical gear step off the platform in front of her, along the wall of the station. He looked around at all the groaning, injured workers and then at her. Slowly, he stepped aside and motioned at the lift. Feel free to use it, hopefully without beating me up." She stepped up onto the metal platform and pressed the lever to get it humming forward back the way the electrician had come from. She shook her head a little and blinked as she finally got her full senses back after the headbutt. The lift hummed along the maintenance corridor under the main streets of the station until she came to a junction at the end with a ladder going up and catwalks heading either way. Her implant told her that she had 1.5 miles to go. She was about to head up onto the street level when the station contacted her again. "Wakefield, we found the cartel's command post." The indicator flashed on her map and she smiled. Putting her mask free, she sealed it into place, and instead of heading up onto the street, walked to the other side, approaching an airlock. She pulled a maintenance pressure suit free, putting it on, and grabbing some gear. Nothing but an ordinary maintenance worker to see here as she opened the airlock and stepped out on the outside of the station.
Where the hell is the human?
The cartel boss was literally slimy Yervy and screamed out with the thugs in front of him from behind his desk. He had an aquarium of rare and exotic fish on the wall behind them, many endangered and illegal to own. The pelts and heads of various endangered animals decorating the floor and walls of his office. There were a number of Dekish, Gulk, and Taken in front of him, getting chewed out from being unable to stop a single human. He was in the middle of yelling at them when they heard something tap on the glass window to the side. Everyone looked and saw a pressure suit of a maintenance worker wave at them. A few Dekish waved back, unsure what was going on. Then the figure slapped a plastic brick on the window and jumped back.
Oh shit,
was the last thing the cartel boss said before the brick exploded, sucking them all out into space. The fish in the aquarium just swam on, unaware of what just happened. After a nice little spacewalk, Wakefield finally stepped back into the station proper, right next to the Trade Conference Center. She pulled the bulkier suit off, back in her form-fitting black catsuit. She walked up the stairs and out onto the main street, leading into an important center, finding a large number of Skulkian guards. The Skulkians were one of the triumvirates, a species of multi-limbed scorpion-like insectoids. They were incredibly hardy and durable in combat, especially hand-to-hand.
Halt, human! There has been fighting in the station. We need to see your ID before you can enter.
That's fine. She smiled and reached for a pocket to grab her ID. It was empty. She frowned and began to pat herself down as she suddenly realized her ID was sitting in that secure courier room back where she'd started.
Hold on a second.
She turned away from them and tapped her comm.
Station, I'm outside. I forgot my ID.
There was a sigh over the line.
I'll be right there.
She turned back and smiled at the guards. Then, as she waited, she swung her arms back and forth, lightly clamping them together while she whistled. Finally, the human diplomat stepped up behind the guards, speaking to them as she was let by. She smiled and pulled a secure box from her back, walking into the trade conference, ready to show the triumvirate something no other species had ever thought of. About an hour later, they were standing in front of a panel of triumvirate ambassadors. The Skulkians were the muscle, strong and solid. The Phoenix were the engineers, inquisitive and intelligent, while the noble Norvians in the center were the diplomats, since they were so charismatic and cunning. The human diplomat and Agent Wakefield stood before them and inspected what the human delegation had set before them.
This is what you bring us?
We've seen inventions and materials and more, and you simply bring us food, the tall, graceful Norvian said, and as he inspected the plate in front of him.
This is the best you have to offer?
It's a family recipe. My family has handed down generation to generation, Agent Wakefield said with a smile. They're called chocolate chip cookies. Try them. The delegates picked up the small hot discs in front of them and gingerly bit a piece off. They all started to nod and hum happily as they tasted it, quickly finishing the first they had picked up.
Our large shipment of materials to make you more of these was sabotaged, so we had to make a much smaller batch. You each have 3, and a small box to share. If you give us more time, we can make you more, the diplomat was saying.
The delegates ate the cookies quickly, never having had anything like it before.
You see, we know other species might have better tech than us, and anything can be reverse engineered or copied with time. Resources can be acquired through trade or conquest. But so far, we haven't found any species with the concept of desserts, the diplomat said with a smile. Suddenly, the Skulkian pulled the top off the box of extra cookies that he had been provided. The other delegates watched as he shoved them into his mouth, chomping down on them as he shuddered in pleasure. Then he grabbed the boxes from in front of the other 2 delegates, tucking them under the back limbs as he scurried around the table and charged Agent Wakefield. She gasped in surprise as she was lifted up above his head in a multitude of limbs. The cookie-making human is mine. He started running towards the exit. Prepare my ship. We go to Earth. More cookies. More!
Put me down, the agent was crying out as she was carried off. The human diplomat and the other 2 triumvirate delegates shared awkward glances for a moment. Finally, the Norvian coughed and spoke up.
Apologies, we'll, award you the trade contract. So you said this is something called, dessert. The diplomat smiled.
Why, yes. Let me explain to you more about the best humanity has to offer. End of story.
I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholt, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.